Morning, everyone, and welcome to the very first episode of Universe Rights for the new year for 2022. And I wish each one of you will have a fantastic year ahead, much better than what we've been going through for the last 2 years. With that, I'd like to give a very warm welcome to our speaker for the day, Abbas Gazaroni, who's a lawyer and an actor and a writer and a producer. His acting roles have led him to the London stage in Sleuth, and he's also done shows for the BBC, for the HBO. So you've got a bit of a celebrity status happening here, guys. But for me, the most valuable thing about Abbas is that he's the author of best-selling books on 2 Feet and Wings and The Boy with Two Lives, both books that stem from his own life. Abbas has also been represented by Siahi, and we're extremely, extremely proud to have worked with him. And we were just talking about what he's writing next. So we pinned him down again. And moderating the session for us today is an equally accomplished writer, also some sort of a Bollywood person, so to say. As she says, she loves Bollywood. Vinita Coelho, who has several books under her belt. She's written a whole series for children. A couple of them are Tiger by the Tail, Dead as a Dodo. She's writing extensively for television and also has a big role to play in a lot of mainstream films that have come out of Bombay. There are telefilms also that she's made called The Wild Rose, The Picnic, The Lost Son. She's also written screenplays for multi-starrers like We Are Family. But for me, again, what matters to us is that she has written some of the best books, and she's also written for slightly older children, House of Stars and Whisper in the Wind, again, which we've been very, very proud to represent, Vinita. And I was giving her the same kind of spiel before we get into the session that she needs to finish writing what she's promised that she's going to write. With that, I'm going to leave you all in the hands of Vinita, who will take this session forward. Thanks so much for joining us today. And I know it's a morning time, which is very unusual for us to do an event, but because of the time difference with Abbas being 12 hours behind, it was just something that we had to do this way. But I'm really, really thankful that each one of you has joined us today. Over to you, Vinita.
Good morning, everyone. And it's worth getting up and joining us for the session because we have with us Abbas. And Abbas, I've been fascinated both by your books and by the journey that brought these books out. I mean, you had a really long journey as a writer and as a person, starting from a little kid in Iran to where you are today, lawyer, actor, producer. And just to give everyone context so that we know where your writing comes from, I'd like you to share this journey with us. Just tell us that long and wonderful life that you've lived.
Absolutely. First of all, I just want to say thank you so much for inviting me. First of all, I'd love to, I'm very grateful and honored to be sharing kind of the stage with you. And I want to give a big shout out to Mita, who is predominantly responsible for me actually being a published author in the first place. And she got me out in the international stage, and she's been a phenomenal agent for me. And she, her response rate, just phenomenal. I can't speak highly enough about her. But in order to answer your question, my journey, this could also take 45 minutes in itself, but I will keep it short. I was born in Iran, and I had even though I was born on the cusp of the revolution, year before the revolution happened, I was born in 1978. I had a very good childhood. There was a big age difference between my parents, but, they kind of hid me from, the ugliness of the world and the war, even though my parents were very much kind of anti-establishment of the new regime, and my dad was closely linked with the prior regime. Everything was going well until I started hitting 7 or 8. And then because of the politics, my father was trying to get me out of the country for various reasons. And even though the government had confiscated his passports, the idea was that my mother and I, we would sell everything, and my mother and I would go to Turkey to try and get a visa to go abroad and live with some relatives in the United Kingdom. And for reasons that, you're going to probably have to read the book and I don't have enough time to get into, we sold everything. That amounted to $1,701 at the airport. My mother was not permitted to leave with me. And my father kind of made a judgment call that he was going to send me to Turkey by myself a couple of weeks before my 8th birthday. And I was put on a plane by myself to meet a random stranger who was going to allegedly look after me in Istanbul. And I arrived there. I was greeted by somebody and they deserted me right there in the airport. And I spent almost 4 months in Istanbul as a child, working a few jobs and trying to get a UK visa to go to England to live with a relative. And then that was a whole journey, kind of like a surreal experience now that I look back on it as an adult. Trials and tribulations in Istanbul, and then by some miracle, I did get a visa to go to England, just through the graciousness and kindness of so many different strangers that came into my life. And then I went to England thinking all my troubles are over, and the guardian and the relative that I had ended up being not such a nice individual, and I was kind of became abused. And after kind of putting up with it and, being put through kind of a series of situations where I was living in a deserted house and working, and I was leading a dual life because I had a scholarship to go to boarding school, and I was living with the most prestigious and the richest children in England. And then during the holidays, I was being put and working in a kitchen at night because it was illegal for a child to be working. And anyway, ultimately, I ran away and became an orphan, and I was homeless and I was homeless for about 4 months, 3.5, 4 months. Again, while leading a double life, I was because I'd got a scholarship to my secondary school, my high school, but only as a day boy, not as a boarder. And so I was living rough at night. I was going to a public school during the day. And ultimately, it got found out, and I was taken in by another relative who was much kinder, and they took me in. They ultimately tried to adopt me, which didn't work out, but then I had to go to the High Court in London, which kind of gave the genesis of the whole legal thing in my head. And I was adopted at 2 months before my 18th birthday. I went to university in England. I got my master's. I went to acting school in England. And then after 3, 4, 5 years of acting professionally, I took the LSAT to go be a lawyer in America, and I went to law school in America, and then I stayed and have resided in America and started my own law firm 15 years ago out of a coffee shop, and now I have 50 employees and 20 lawyers that work for me. So that is the arc and the journey in a nutshell.
That's amazing, and that arc and the journey is told in 2 books, On 2 Feet and Wings and The Boy with 2 Lives, right? I have to tell you, I was reading The Boy with 2 Lives last night, and you reduced me to tears. I was just reading the book and crying. So the thing I wanted to ask you was, this kind of journey could so easily have lent itself to an adult book, and yet you chose to write 2 children's books in this genre. Why did you make that choice?
That's a fascinating question, Benita, but the truth of it is, I didn't intend for it initially to be a children's book. I started writing when I first wrote the first book through the perspective of myself at that time as an adult. And I wrote a chapter or 2, and I started reading it back to myself, and it wasn't true. Like it wasn't sitting true with me. So I scrapped it and I started again, and it's written because my memories of these things are from the perspective of a child, because I lived through that, right? And so the way I look at an airport, an international airport like right now, is very different than the way I looked at it alone at the age of, barely like turning 8. Because when you're a child, everything seems so much bigger. It seems so much faster, so much more enormous, and everything is exaggerated because you're a child. And I didn't think I could do justice to the story writing from an adult's perspective, because my memories of it were not through the purview of an adult. They were through the purview of a child. And in fact, if you read the second book, it's a darker book and there's like some profanity in it where appropriate because that's what happened, right? And it's because I was older when that was happening. And so the books are written through the purview of the memories that I had at that particular time in my life. And that's why they were written for children. I didn't sit down and go, oh, I'm going to write children's books. So that's the journey I had to take. And they just came out that way.
Okay. Your book is also full of random acts of kindness from strangers.
Yeah.
Hasn't it been quite fascinating to what degree your life is actually dictated by random acts of kindness?
So you actually touched upon a really, really important thing for me. A lot of people come up to me and they say, oh, I've read your book and, you're such a brave, tenacious and, individual. And I say, I appreciate that and thank you. And there's a certain element of character that had to go into it. But one of the main themes of both books, especially the first one, is the fact that human beings are more good than they are bad. But for these random acts of kindness, they're littered with it. But for random acts of kindness by complete strangers, I would not be sitting where I am today. These are people that had no nexus to me, no connection to me, that had no duty to me. And yet they chose to do sometimes very small things that made such a huge difference to me, my mindset, my confidence, and sometimes big things. Like, in the first book, there is a taxi driver that spent 2.5 hours of my life with me, but he made such an incredible difference at such an important time in that journey. With the first night I was in Istanbul. But yes, absolutely. And I think it's really astute of you to pick up on that, because most people talk about the main theme of the protagonist being, bravery and courage and all these things. And I think there's an element of that. But my main, one of the biggest themes is actually what you just pointed out.
I think I picked up on that because my life too has been full of random acts of kindness. And I think that's all we can offer each other at the end of the day, really, especially in these difficult times when lots of people are struggling. Acts of kindness is all that you can put out into the world. I also wanted to ask you, as writers, our imagination is so infused with the stories that we heard as little children. But when you were a little kid, you didn't hear stories in English. English language you learned much later. So
Yeah.
What was the storytelling culture that you grew up in?
There was a lot of storytelling because obviously, when I grew up as a child in Iran, films were illegal. There were no TV shows, there were no movies, there was only religious programming. And so most of our entertainment came from just sitting around and talking. And I lived with my grandmother, which you probably know from reading my first book, and I loved kind of story time with her. And she grew up in a time where there was no TV, period. And she would tell me stories about, things she went through at the turn of the century. She was born in the 1800s. And so she was telling me stories and telling me how the world has changed before her eyes, because she lived to 102 before she passed. And she really had seen a whole century in her life. And, with the turn of the Industrial Revolution and going into the 19th and the 20th century, she really saw the world change. And it was those story times at night. She used to put me to bed, and I used to be in awe of my father, who was a businessman, and he always used to come and tell me stories about how our great grandfather, who was an entrepreneur, and he used to do this, and he went to China, which back in that time there were no planes. He traveled to China by himself. So storytelling was a huge part of my upbringing. And it was by circumstance, because culturally in Iran at that time, there was no other entertainment but the entertainment you created for yourself. And as a child, I was like a sponge. So I loved these stories, and I used to beg my grandmother for stories. And of course, there would be some embellishment, and I used to love it. And my dad would tell me stories, and that's what I lived for. And so storytelling is a huge part of my childhood and the culture that I came from.
There's one other kind of storytelling that was part of your childhood that you told me about, right? And that has an Indian connection.
Absolutely.
Tell us your story.
Yeah. So as I mentioned, like, in Iran at the time, we had no entertainment in the form of TV and films. And the only kind of movies that we really would get any access to were from Bollywood. And they would be smuggled through India, through Pakistan, into Iran. And every week, there'll be this gentleman that would come and knock on the door, like, in a long coat and, very, kind of dodgy, if you like. And he would come in and he would have a Samsonite briefcase and he would open it and there'd be maybe 4 or 5 videos. And he would stand there, and 98% of these videos were from Bollywood. Maybe 2% would be if there was a massive Hollywood blockbuster, like Rocky was the one I always remember. But most of them were from Bollywood. And he would sit there and he would stand there and give a 30-second kind of the Iranian 81, 82 equivalent of a movie trailer would be this gentleman standing there giving a 30-second rendition of what the movie's about. So there'd be this guy, and then there'd be the girl, and then they fell in love, but then one was rich, one was poor, they would be separated, but destiny would bring them back together, and then he would move on to the next movie. And so I would always be allowed to choose 1, maybe 2 on a good week movies, and we would keep it for the week. And then next week it would come back, and then I would give 2 back. It was like early version of Blockbuster. I would give 2 back, take 2 back, like for the next week. And there were certain movies that kind of changed my life. And like, my childhood hero, believe it or not, was Amitabh Bachchan. He was like my God. When I watched Sholay, it changed my life. I would not allow my parents to give that video back. I said, I will work till I would do anything they wanted if we could buy that video. And I must have watched Sholay over 100 times. And it's a long movie. It's like 3-4 hours long. And I would know, I don't speak the language over there, but I would know these songs, and I would be making up words if I thought I understood them or I heard them, and I'd be singing along. And even to this day, I want to make a kind of a journey to Mumbai to meet my childhood hero. So Bollywood movie were the only kind of real childhood access I had to kind of modern entertainment. And these movies were phenomenal, the Raj Kapoors of the world, and these guys were literally the childhood heroes. And to this day, I have the most endearing memories of those movies, because in a time where we had no entertainment, that's what kind of got us through in a war-torn country with little else to do.
Yeah, I think everyone has a Sholay story. I grew up in Calcutta, and it was a 5-story building, and the 3 stories below us were a cinema hall. And we were on the 4th floor, and Sholay came to the cinema hall and stayed there for 5 years. And we'd have all of this dialogue vibrating to the floor. We'd go down and watch it. So, I think I beat you on the 100 times of watching
You
Sholay.
probably did.
And I think that's the reason I eventually became a Bollywood girl and started writing films, because I was so enamored of this entire world of filmmaking.
Absolutely.
I wanted to ask you, you learned English later in life. You didn't grow up speaking English. Correct. And I find that all of us writers who come from colonized countries, where English isn't our first language, have very complicated relationships with English. So what is your relationship with English like? What does English mean to you? What did it give you access to?
So I think it's such a great question. I've never been asked before. But I really do have a relationship, because at first it was a barrier to entry, because I didn't know the language. It wasn't my mother tongue. And I remember going into boarding school, and I could not speak a word of, the only words I knew were hello, yes, no, thank you, pretty much. That was my rendition of the English language. And I remember I was the only non-white person in the school. I was the only person that didn't speak English in the school. And I went to a very posh British boarding school, and they were playing things like rugby and cricket that I had never seen before. And I needed to learn the language in order to be able to do what the other boys were doing. And because I was so young, I became at least fluent, notwithstanding random words in my vocabulary that I had to enhance as I grew older. And I became fluent in maybe 4 or 5 months, tops. And I became better than my friends at English, because I was taught the correct way. So my grammar was always better than them. They always had slightly better vocabulary, at least at the beginning. But in English grammar, I would always start topping the class because I hadn't learned any slang yet. I was learning the words correctly, the syntax, everything I was learning correctly. And it gave me this barrier into being able to compete with my peers on a level playing field. And when I became good at it, it gave me this confidence. And I remember one day, 2-3 years in living in England, that I recognized that I was dreaming and thinking in English, and it was gradually becoming my mother language. Even though it wasn't, it was my adopted mother language. And it enabled me to do things and become who I am today because of my relationship with the English language. And it enabled me to write books, for example, and it gives me the power to do my job and represent my clients in a court of law that changes lives. And that is something that I have to sometimes take a step back and think about, because I have an incredible job with an incredible amount of power that I don't take for granted. And but for my thirst to master that English language, which I never will, but for that ability to use the English language, I would not be able to help my clients better their lives. And in a democracy, that relationship with the language that we are in is paramount, of paramount importance.
You know, this series of conversations is called The Universe Writes. And I love it because, even when I read your books, I thought it was so important that these stories get out there, because the world of English writing, or especially for kids, is dominated by very white stories. And I'm so glad that you brought your story into this. What kind of reception did your books have?
They've had a phenomenal reception. And I think before I even get to the reception, it's so important that you kind of brought that up, because there's a reason why I wrote these books. And there's a level of importance. And so the first reason was really my mother. And so when my mother died, my birth mother died when I was 11 years old. And I felt like there is this debt that I can never pay for the sacrifices she made for me. And I mean that, it's an unpayable debt. And that sacrifice is something that I did not know what to do in order to at least preserve her memory, because I would always talk about my mother, and but we're mortal, and I wanted something to be able to preserve that memory of her for perpetuity. And even if I could get one book in a library somewhere collecting dust, maybe in 500 years' time, there would be somebody that may pick that book up and recognize her memory far beyond my mortality and my lifetime. And that was what really motivated me to write the book. But there were secondary reasons of why I wanted to write the book, because I thought that the story was an important one to tell, because I am one of so many people from that part of the world that struggled. I tell it like a micro story in a macro world of the Middle East, of people that, even Syria today, there are people that are going through much worse than I had to go through. And it was important to tell the story, to be able to put historically into perspective, because what I'm most proud of is that my book is on the curriculum in Australia and New Zealand now, and certain schools in the US, and they read it in English literature or world studies, world history, and so it tells the story of one person, in that historical time, and it gives historical perspective to the struggles of Middle Eastern people, specifically Iranians. But it also shows, going back to the themes that you pointed out, of the kindness of individuals, and all these kind acts were by Middle Eastern people in a time where for the last 30 to 40 years, Middle Eastern culture has been predominantly getting bashed in the press, because we only hear the bad, we never hear the good. And like my mother used to say when I was a child, a bag of sugar is ruined by a few grains of salt. The news only covers the grains of salt, and it never sees the bag of sugar. And I wanted to kind of give some speckles of what sugar actually exists in so many cultures, including the Middle Eastern one. And in level of importance, that is why I wrote the book. And the reception is far beyond my wildest dreams. Like my ambition was just to get a published copy in like I told you, in a library or two. But I went to, like, number one in the readers list with Mita's help, of course, like from week upon week, like when the first book was published. And then it went into publication in different countries. And now, like I told you, like it's been so well received that like children study my literature, which to me is like, I'm a bit of an academic nerd. Like to me, that's the greatest compliment I could ever be given. And I'm the hardest critic of myself is me. And so, like, for me, I mean, it's beyond my wildest dreams, really. So I'm just so privileged and honored in so many different ways.
Oh, this is also what I feel as writers. Our job is so much more than just to entertain. It is to give a voice to the voiceless. It is to bring correct history. It is to give other perspectives. And it's an incredibly important job. I have so many people say, oh, you write for children, and they just presume it's an easy job. And writing for children is not an easy job, because you are talking to their souls, you're talking to their hearts, you're talking to their minds. So yes, I'm so glad that you put that story out there, and I'm so glad it's got the reception that it has, that the world has welcomed it. The world needs more stories that come from outside of the mainstream. Really, really, the universe writes, and people need to learn that the universe writes, not just the West.
Yeah.
Has your book managed to travel back to Iran? Has it been translated into Farsi?
It has been translated into Farsi, but not with my permission. Like, I found out one day somebody showed up and like, oh, your book is in Farsi. I'm like, really? Like, I never gave my permission for that. But like, and so I mean, I haven't been back to Iran. Yeah, but it has been published illegally. So yeah.
So you do a lot more than write, Abbas. You also act, and you're a lawyer. And I wanted to ask you, between acting and writing, what does writing give you that acting doesn't? I mean, how are they different in your mind and in your creative journey?
There's such different art forms. And like, acting is like, what writing, as a writer, you're the puppeteer. Like you set the rules. And even if you're writing, like, whether it's a play or whether it's a movie script, even not even book, you set the terms. You set the terms of whether it's fictional, non-fictional, naturalistic, non-naturalistic. You set every term, which an actor may have to interpret later. But what I love about writing is that, you have. You can go choose any word out there that's available, even make up words on occasion. Didn't stop Shakespeare doing that, right? And so, like, you really have huge spectrum of tools available to you, and obviously time is on your side, and you can take as little or as long as you want in writing. My process is actually a quick one. Once I know I'm going to write, I write, and I don't do anything but write. I'm tunnel vision. But there are writers that take 3, 4, 10 years to write a book, right? And that's their luxury as a writer. And you set the terms. Whereas as an actor, the terms are set to you by the writer and the director. And your job is one of being of a messenger, of being able to interpret the text for an audience in simple terms. Obviously, it's a little bit more to it than that, but very different art forms. And with their own set of complexities, and like, I don't like, they're very different. And I enjoy them both in very different ways. And when I'm acting, I miss writing, and when I'm writing, I miss acting. It's like, the grass is always greener. So yeah, like, but they're very different for me.
I wanted to ask you about process. I'm a single mom, and I find myself, I have to earn a living, and then I end up writing the cracks because life is so busy. You seem to have a really busy life. So how do you write? What's your process? Do you write the cracks? Do you have a fixed time? What would your process as a writer be?
well, if I had my way, I would like be, you know, traveling, like in writing in coffee shops and stuff like that. But unfortunately, life is not like that. And so, you know, they say, if you want done something right, ask a busy person, or if something done, ask a busy person. And
Yeah.
so, like, I'm very disciplined, like about blocks of time where I just choose to, I am going to write, and I'm not going to get up until I've written 3,000, 6,000 words. And there are prolific writers out there that, like, they're not necessarily the best writers in the world, but like, I'll name you one that I don't necessarily hold in high esteem, but in sales, she's out there, like Danielle Steele, like, for example, sold millions and millions of books. Yeah, but she sits down and writes 6,000 words a day, 5 days a week. It's a discipline. Now, irrespective of what we think of the content, that's a process, right? Like, I mean, the content is very different, right? But we're just talking about process. And so when I wrote my first book, I knew I had a opportunity between taking the bar exam and getting the results. So I had this window, and I wrote the book in 4 weeks. It was rough, like, you know, it needed editing, but I wrote a novel in 4 weeks. I would go and write every single day. The second one, I already had my practice going. It was a little bit more difficult, but I would set out 2 days here, 2 days there, 2 days there, and I did it over a space of a few months. But I would definitively go and say, I'm going to write from this time to this time. The upside of writing an autobiography is that you don't need to know what happens next. Like, you already know that, right? It's just outlining. I outline where what portions I'm going to highlight in which chapters. I thumbnail it, and then I just go write. And I think the hardest thing for people is to overthink the writing process, and which stops you actually writing. And you know, when people come and say to you, and I don't know what advice you give them, it's like, what does it take to be an author? I'm just like, write whatever you think, just write. Like just write. Unless you have something to show, you've got to, to use a bad analogy, you can't win a raffle without buying a ticket, right? Your ticket is to write. And so, as bad as it may be, at least you have a product which differentiates you from 99% of the populace. So write, and you're already winning. And whether it gets published or not, or anything else, that's gravy. But write.
I give them exactly the same advice. I give them Ernest Hemingway's advice, which was, writing is a matter of getting your butt on the chair. That's what it is. You sit down and you write. And I spent my early years writing television. I used to write daily soaps. And when you write a daily soap, you could be dying, but you have to write, because you have to write an episode a day. That's the way it goes. And I'm always grateful for that fantastic discipline it taught me, because having done daily soaps, you no longer have writer's blocks because you can't afford them. You sit down and you write. So that's, great advice.
Yeah.
But I want to know.
I'm sorry. Here you go.
Sorry, I was going to ask my other question, but you have something to add.
Yeah, I was just saying, but ultimately what it comes down to outside of talent is the discipline. Like anything, if you want to work out, lose weight, whatever, it's the consistency. And there's no difference in writing. Like, the talent is what distinguishes great from good. But and don't let perfection is the enemy of they say perfection is the enemy of the good, right? But very few people create a perfect a manuscript or text. There's very few that would get into that category. Discipline, in my opinion, is almost more important than talent, because it's what distinguishes you from almost everybody, because you have a product. But I don't want to over dwell on that. I want to move on to your next question.
So my next question is, what are you working on now? Do you think that you have a fiction book in you? What's coming up next?
So I have a fictional novel in my mind, which I'm not ready to talk about yet, which is going to be a longer work, but I'm working on a series of actually younger children. Like, this is intentionally for children. Like, my first two novels were not intentionally for children, like we discussed, but these are actually kind of like bedtime storybooks for 5 to 7 year olds, because one of the things that used to really inspire me as a child was that my father used to talk about how our family were kind of business people. And as I have grown, I've got involved in more businesses. I own several businesses, and I think there's very little literature for 5 to 7 year olds where the very basic concepts of business are taught. There's a lot about good and evil, love, and, things like that, but there's very little about the simple business concepts. And I've written the first one, which is actually being illustrated right now, about the concept of compound interest through more kind of simplistic terms with animals and farming, but trying to teach the concept of compound interest. And so once that's done, the idea is that I do a series of them, like 4 or 5, teaching basic business concepts for small children.
I'm so glad you're doing that, because I can't tell you how many times I would think that, damn, I wish my dad had taught me this. My dad was a salaried man. He had no idea about business. And these were lessons you really need to know. Life lessons are not just the ethics and the morals. There's also practical stuff like this. What the hell is compound interest? And you better not be paying it. So great. That's really interesting. Okay, I'm going to open up to questions from the audience. So if anyone has a question for Abbas, just put your hand up or type it out there for us and he will answer it. I know you've been enjoying this entire conversation. All of you guys have been enjoying it as much as I have, because he's great to chat to. So let's have a few questions from audience. And if they don't have any, I've got lots.
Oh, wow. Your questions have been so good. Like, the usual questions did not come up at all, really. Like, yours were very, very original. I love them. Because it keeps the answers fresher. Then they're not regurgitated answers that I've done on many other panels. So do you want to talk?
When you were abandoned in the airport in Turkey, how did you stay in touch with your parents?
So when I first went to the motel that I found ultimately, I quickly called them, gave them the number so that they could call me back at that motel. And then we had a routine where they would say, we'll call you at this time on this day, because there were obviously no mobile phones back then. So I would just be waiting in the lobby, waiting for them to call at the times that they would tell me that they're going to call me. So that's how we stayed in touch.
Abbas, that is, as a parent, that's my nightmare, that my child is far away from me and there's nothing I can do from them. They're in a completely alien land. My God, that's so scary.
Exactly.
Shiv has an answer. Shiv has a question for you. He wants to know what your favorite writers are.
Oh, wow. That's so tough. Like Mark Twain, it was one of my favorites. Robert Louis Stevenson was like a phenomenal writer. Just like it really as a child, obviously I had unusual stresses, right? Like that for a child to have. And the writers that used to kind of make me completely forget everything, Mark Twain, Robert Louis Stevenson, Charles Dickens for me was hit and miss. Some I loved and some were just very hard reading, right? And so, but like I would, and then there's actually a Russian writer, Alexander Solzhenitsyn. I read the Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, was one of my favorite books as a child, about like this person in the Gulag, trying to get through a day and like thinking about escaping and things like that. Like these kind of fantastical situations are what really kind of made me drift away. When you watch a good movie, it makes you forget about everything, or watch a good play or something. These are the writers that kind of took me away from my troubles.
So Ranjana wants to know, what do you hope readers will take away from your books?
That's a great question. I mean, I've kind of talked about some of them, the main issues I would want a reader to take away, which is obviously number one, that people are more kind than they are evil. Number two, that there are a lot of kind Middle Easterners out there, and and that know about their struggles in that historical time in world history. And I think obviously perseverance and positive thinking does so much for you to be able to, if you can visualize your goals and you're positive about them. And I've talked very widely about this particular topic. My biggest weakness was my age, but that was also my biggest strength. My naivety never really allowed me to think about, well, statistically, you're not going to get this visa to go to England. statistically, or like, think about it, like, what am I going to do? How am I going to go home with my tail between my legs? When I was there as a child to get a visa to go to England, and in my head, I always thought, yeah, that's what I'm going to do. And it was inadvertent positive thinking and visualizing that this is going to happen that I think really helped my confidence and really helped me achieve what I wanted to do. And so those are the things that I would want a reader to take away in no particular order.
So you've kind of already answered the next question, which was, were you able to combat the challenges that faced you? You've kind of...
Yeah, I think I just addressed that, right.
The next question that we have is from Dr. Mukesh Patra. He's asked if you could detail a couple of the random acts of kindness you mentioned earlier in the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. So one I already mentioned, but I'll give you a little bit more context to it. I was, like I said, at the cusp of turning 8. I'm at an international airport by myself that could have been easily taken advantage of. And this taxi driver called Ahmed decided, because he was a kind man, to take me under his wing. And I had a list of motels to go check out and get pricing on. And he would take me from motel to motel, and he would go talk to the owners, the managers, and try and negotiate a price. And then he'd be like, no, you don't want to go into this one. And then he's the one that helped me find the one where I actually ended up settling. And that choice was a great choice because I became friends with the person that ran that hotel. And this individual probably spent 2 hours of his life helping me because he was a good man. Another example would be, I would go into the consulate for my next visit, in my journey to try and get a visa, and I couldn't speak a lick of English, and I would try and find somebody to help me translate. And like there were these ladies that I would go to say, could you help me? And they would help me translate from Farsi to English, and they would tell me the documents that I would need to come back with. And again, these people were giving their time to a complete stranger when they didn't have to. And so these are just a couple of examples of where people were just completely giving a few minutes or a few hours of their time to a complete stranger when they didn't have to.
Thank you, Abbas. Vandana Mehta has a question. I'm just going to allow her to talk so she can ask her. She's raised her hand. Okay, while we wait for her to unmute herself, the next question that we have is from Deepa Mishra. She says, thank you, Vinita and Abbas, for the wonderful session. I would like to know that you're a writer, actor, producer. The list is long, but according to you, how different your life would have been if you had stayed back in Tehran?
That's a really, really good question. I think I've wondered about that hypothetical myself, and I think I would have probably have been a writer, but I always wonder, I always talk about the difference between good and like excellent, right? And the excellent is the talent. And I think maybe in my own mother tongue, where I didn't have to learn the extra language, where I had 7-8 years, those like very, very, very important early years, I would have been able to really master the Farsi language and been like of a poetic kind of caliber, the Rumis or the Hafezes of the Persian culture. And I fancy myself there, maybe not even close, like maybe a league below them, but that kind of thing. But it's just all hypotheticals and what ifs. But I think I'm a very driven and ambitious individual. So I think wherever I would have landed, I would have made it work, as long as I was alive, of course. And I think that's the big variable that we don't know about, because of the war. But I've thought about it, and that's what I guess fantasized about, but I don't know.
Thank you. The next question is from Kashish Khandelwal, who asks if you harbor any complaints or are thankful to the life that dished up to you in the difficult way.
I have no complaints. Every day I wake up and I think I am so lucky. I am so lucky because of the opportunities that I have. And there was a period of time after my 18th birthday. Well, I was just turning 18, right after I got adopted, when my childhood caught up with me. And I started feeling very sorry for myself, and I didn't like the individual I was becoming because I was complaining and I was feeling sorry for myself. And I took a year out between high school and university, and I went to what was at the time the second poorest country in the world, which was Malawi. And I lived in Africa for a year. I could write a whole book about my journeys in Africa, by the way, but that's a different conversation. And, I even got malaria, and I would refuse to go back to England because I wanted to see my journey through, because I always knew that I had that light at the end of that tunnel of going back to this comfortable Western lifestyle. And I really witnessed what deprived people were going through. And I purposely lived in a hut with no electricity, no running water for that year, because I wanted to see life at its rawest level of people that really are in need, that have a lot to complain about. And I think even though, irrespective of the journeys I'd been through before of that, that is the experience that really changed my life. Like as an adult, I felt like I went there as a boy and I came home as a man, because every day after that, I was just grateful. I was like, I don't have to go through that every day. And every opportunity that I've ever had, I've grasped with two hands and been thankful for it. And irrespective of, of course you get down, we all get stressed, we have all our problems, but that is what gives me perspective. And life is about perspective. And perspective is, whatever rough time we're having, I guarantee you there is somebody that would wish they were in your situation. And if you can have that perspective, you should have no complaints. Because if we're spending time and energy on complaining, we're not spending time being positive. And that's depriving you as the complainer opportunities to better yourself and do all these great things that we can in the societies we live in. So I have zero complaints.
Thank you. The next question is, how much do you remember your motherland when?
Specificity, the street I grew up on, my house, and in my closest environment. And I think I've just been blessed with a really, really good memory. But obviously, all the places I traveled to, I remember, but it's again through the eyes and the perspective of a child. And I'm sure if I went back there now, it would probably look very different. And not just because it's changed, but because my perspective is different. But I remember where I'd been, and especially where I lived.
Right. Dr. Batra has a follow-up question. He asked that now that you're a successful lawyer, actor, writer, do you consciously find ways to help random strangers?
Yes, absolutely. And I think it goes to anything, I think small acts of kindness can be, like I told you, like a big deal for that individual. So for example, I walk past a homeless man, I sometimes go buy him a coffee, or some to anything. And I mandate all my lawyers at my law firm. We all do I think we are up to 120 hours of pro bono work for people that can't afford legal services. And so, and I, try a bunch of, jury trials for the federal court for indigenous people that can't afford lawyers. And so, yeah, I do a lot of trial work. I do a lot of free legal pro bono work, and I make all my lawyers do it as well. And so with power, and wealth comes responsibility. And it's something I preach through all my associates and junior lawyers and everybody that I work with, 100%.
That's wonderful. The next question is from Sukant, who asks, are there any other books in English about the eclectic times or regime of the 16th century Persia?
Which century Persia?
16th century Persia.
16th century Persia. I'm not sure about 16th century Persia. No, I don't know. I really don't know. That's why 16th century? I'm just curious.
Okay, we'll let him get back to us on that one.
Okay, yeah.
Sunita has said that you seem to have written reality-based stories so far. You say that you're working on fiction novels too. What is your take on fantasy stories? Do you think you might take up this genre sometime in the future in your writing?
In fantasy?
Yes.
Maybe. I'll never say never to anything. I don't see myself going into that genre, but if I educate myself a little bit more, I may become fascinated. I'm kind of, I have little spurts of, oh my God, I'm obsessed by something and I'm all in. And I've never really kind of been in that realm. And I don't think so, but I won't say never.
The next question is, which genre do you prefer most for writing? And if you could tell one of your books which has very much portrayed your experience.
Which genre do I prefer? Like, which genre of
Prefer
writing?
most, yes, while writing.
I think kind of like I told you, kind of adventure story, like the adventure stories and spy novels, because it's kind of the thing I'm most obsessed about. So I read a lot of spy novels. It's kind of like my relaxation time, and also adventure stories. That's where the Robert Louis Stevenson, Treasure Island kind of stories. I just love those. And Robinson Crusoe was one of my favorite books as a child, and even today. Like if I can find a book in that genre, I'm all over it. So that's my favorite. And then what was the second part of the question? I'm sorry.
If you could name a work of yours which very much portrays your experience.
A book that I've read, you mean?
I think they mean a book that you've written.
Well, I've only written two. So like, and they're both autobiographies. So I lived both of them. Yeah.
Great. If there's any more questions, okay, yeah, there's more here. Having a different nationality and not being able to speak English initially, what was your mental condition? Even now, what is the one thing you would suggest people to keep going during tough times? Okay,
so those are two very different questions. So the first one about it was obviously in my context, and I was obviously in a boarding school and I didn't speak English. And so my mental state at the time was I'm the outsider and I have to do everything I can to learn this language so that I am not the outsider. And English was actually the second thing that neutralized that and made me the insider. I was naturally gifted sportsman, and I ended up getting a sports scholarship because I was really good at rugby and cricket. And so sport was the first neutralizer that made me not be kind of the outsider. But the English language, as I became more and more proficient in it, they accepted me. And what was strange is that, like I mentioned earlier, I was the only kind of non-purely, anglicized white individual in the school. And once I became really good at like rugby and I could speak English, especially in the accent that they were speaking in, like everything, like, the color was neutralized. And I, it was amazing how your accent actually neutralized, the first people's impression of you, which is based upon your skin color, which I guess is human nature, especially for children. And what was the second question?
What is the one thing you would suggest to people to keep going during tough times?
Oh, I think perspective. I think you have to visualize what it is that you want to achieve at the end of like whatever your tough time is. You have to ask yourself, what do I want to happen? And what am I going to do to make that happen? Visualize it, execute it. But also while you're doing that and you're going through tough times, give yourself perspective of how bad is your situation. It may be really bad, but there may be a situation you'd like to be in than the one you are in. And if you give yourself perspective and always try and outdo that negativity with positivity, I think you're going to come through it just okay. And so those are the tips I would personally give.
Right. Juhi wants to know, what role do you think language has to play in the way we write? Would we write differently if we were writing? Would you write differently if you were writing in Farsi?
Yeah, I'm obsessed by Anton Chekhov, for example, who in the Western world is more known for his playwriting, is probably deemed the greatest naturalistic playwright ever. Maybe Henrik Ibsen can compete, but I would say Anton Chekhov is, in my personal subjective opinion. But what in Russia he's most famous for is his short stories. And I really wish I could speak Russian because certain words don't translate. And like there are certain things that you would write that give it that kind of superfluous, like artistic feel like, for example, when I read John Keats in English, I wish I could speak, write the way John Keats used to write his poetry. Like John Keats died at the age of 24. And if you read his entire works, he was, I'm not sure, and I'm going off at a tangent, but I think it's really important for me. So there are 6 romantic poets. And interestingly, Wordsworth was the one that was born first, died last. Then I think Coleridge was born next and he died like second to last. And they all go like that. They bookshelve each other. And then you get Keats, who lived only 24 years and is in the middle. I wish the day I die, I could write maybe with this, with like a fraction of his ability to write. And that flowery language and that mastery of the English language is a God-given talent. And the way you write in other languages, like I wish I could read Chekhov in Russian, because I know it's not translating sometimes when I read it. And so it makes an absolute difference on how you write it and the use of language in writing, 100%. And Keats is a really, really good example. You can't translate Keats into another language. If you try, you can, but I'm sure if you translated Keats into French, it's just not going to work. Like you don't understand, the meter, you don't understand the rhyme. He was a master of our language, and it makes a massive difference, the language that you use in the way that you write.
Right. As a supplementary question, Juhi's asked, do you think we write for a readership in this age in the language of that readership?
I'm sorry, say that again.
Do you think we write for a readership in this age in the language of that readership?
Yeah, I think a lot of, I do, because I think the standard of writing has come down, because I think unfortunately, most people, we live in a society right now that predominantly watches TV, movies, a lot of internet, and people, and we live in a society where time is everything, right? Everything needs to be done in 30 seconds, 2 minutes. And so the standard of writing, like most people don't read broadsheet newspapers, they read tabloid newspapers, and the reading level is really of a 7-8-year-old or a 10-year-old. Even the broadsheets, like the reading age and the literature used has come down, and I think it's the same with the books that are being published in today's society, and part of that is because it's harder to sell books in the 21st century. And in order to be able to sell it, you have to write for your audience. And a lot of the audience does not have the vocabulary that maybe people had in 1960. And I think it's a reality of our society, unfortunately. So 100%. That's a subjective opinion, of course, but that's what I think.
Right. Shiv has asked if you have any tips on international conflict resolution, looking back on your experience and in hindsight.
Yeah, I think they should get some Middle Eastern mothers to put these world leaders in a room and tell them off. Like nobody messes with Middle Eastern mothers. No, I mean, listen, that's the unfortunately, philosophy, philosophy and kind of religious beliefs a lot of the time outdo rationale, like human rationale. And I think that's what still makes us animals, right? Because we believe that we are differentiated, we're different to the rest of the animal kingdom. And unfortunately, our innate instincts like, envy, jealousy, and like greed and all these things overcome rationale and rational thinking. And until we can do that, I don't think you're going to be able to resolve conflict, because conflict has existed from the beginning of time. We've continued to have conflict, and we will continue to do that until we change as a species. And until we're not animals anymore, I don't think we can. I wish I had a better answer for you, but unfortunately, I don't believe that there is a possibility to change international conflict, because at the end of the day, whoever the superpower is going to want to come and eat up the rest. But that's, again, subjective political opinion and nothing to do with me as a writer, but I hope I gave you my opinions.
Right. I know there are some questions left, but I'm sorry, I have to keep to time, and we are done with our hour. With that, I really don't know what to say. I had misgivings that I don't know whether this session is going to work in the morning, but my God, you guys You and Vinita both have blown us away. Thank you so much, Abbas, for giving of yourself with totality, and Vinita for your stupendous questions. I gave you 4 days notice and you turned it around. It's been one of the most brilliant sessions we've had. I'd also like to thank the audience for having asked such beautiful questions, thought out. And it's been a very, very informative and engaging conversation. Just to round it up by saying that the Universe Writes is presented by Sri Cement and it's done in association with the Prabha Khaitan Foundation and Syahi. Until next time, Abbas and Vinita, you've set a very high bar for us. I really have to work hard for the next one.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
Okay, bye-bye.